everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. With the Thanksgiving holiday coming and going, we're supposed to reflect on what we are grateful for. Oftentimes, we fall short of this accomplishment on the holiday dedicated to it, much less in everyday life. Keen listeners will note that we have done an episode on gratefulness already. In that episode, we look at some of its effective elements, while today we'll take a broader approach to the topic. There will certainly be some overlap, but our hope is that the episodes will be complementary in nature rather than redundant. Yeah, so it's funny because we're doing essentially the same thing from 2 years ago. I looked at the episode, the date, and it was Thanksgiving of 2020. We did the episode on gratefulness. Okay. So same thought process sort of crossed our mind. We thought, well, this is the time of year where you're supposed to be.
I think it's actually good that we inadvertently found our way back to it, because I think it indicates something about how we see life.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny because when we opened that episode, I didn't figure out until after we had talked about it and I had written the show notes, and then I went to save them. And as I was typing in the word gratitude, I see gratitude pop up and I go, uh-oh. So I look through the notes. I go, oh, we did do it already. And I looked at some of the notes and I said, oh, okay, well, it looks like we explored a different range of topics from what we're going to look at. So we can do two of them. Yeah. And then I listened to the episode this morning and I go, oh, wow, we covered a lot of ground. We did a good job with that episode. And I'm hoping, like I said in the intro, I'm hoping they'll be complementary. So if you listen to this one, if you go back and listen to the gratitude episode, you'll get a fuller picture of the concept rather than hearing the same thing twice. But yeah. But yeah, what struck me about that is we opened up the episode talking about how difficult it was to be grateful at the time because we were at the height of the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. So you couldn't really go and spend time with your family, and people were losing their jobs, being sick. There's a lot going on in society as a whole. Now, 2 years later, some normality has returned in some aspects of life. But I think that the highlight is that there's always some adversity out there. It doesn't matter really what's going on. There's always something going on in society at large that is perceived as an existential threat of some kind, whether it's the economy or an invading, a war or a pandemic or whatever it is.
But yes, well said. And not to trivialize it at all, but that's why Marvel movies work.
Yeah.
Because hardly ever do the villains get absolutely defeated.
Right.
They come back.
Yeah. And if they do get defeated, there's new villains. And that's just
adversity. It's life.
It's life in general. So there's that societal scope of it. And then there's the individual side of it too. And I think that one is a little different, right? In society, maybe, we can blame the news cycle or we can blame whatever, but there's always something going on that can cause you to feel some sort of stress that takes your mind off of being grateful for things you have.
Yeah.
In your individual life, I think it depends on your circumstances and on your mindset and things, but I think that for a lot of people, there might be stretches of time where you just perceive things as being normal. And then events will be sprinkled in that will cause you great stress or cause you to be grateful.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more up and down rather than just down.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think that, I was talking to my wife about this morning. We were, not rehashing the news, but we were trying to take things in and then what she's doing today and what I'm doing today. And I said to her that I have learned much more than I might have thought I would have at a much earlier time in my life that we need to treat today as if it were the last one.
Hmm.
And that in itself uncorks gratefulness. If you don't look at the people around you, you look at them and say, yeah, I'm always going to see them. Yeah, I'm going to. I don't think I was ever at that particular point, but you can get inattentive and you can get, not in a rut, but in the ordinary habits of the day. And we know all too well that we don't know.
Yeah. And I think that I was in that place. And I think that it's not so much like a failure to be grateful as just a lack of perspective, right? Like, I was very fortunate throughout the early portions of my life to have grandparents and older people that lived very long.
Yeah.
And so even though my parents were a little bit older and their parents were a little bit older, still, my grandparents all, mostly lived into their 90s. So none of them died until I was, in my 20s or so. So up until my mid 20s, late 20s, like I hadn't really experienced death, right? Or, that sense of loss. So it was like, so there was this sort of illusion that it's like, okay, well, this is just the way things are, right? And you have that intellectual knowledge that things will change someday, but like the reality of it is impossible to fathom until you experience it, right?
Yeah.
And so, a year ago, my dad died. So Thanksgiving this year was actually the anniversary of that. And also, like our cat died that we'd had for 14 years and stuff over the year. So, you experience things like that, and those losses, right? I think that there's a couple ways that you can deal with them on a psychological level. And I think the gratitude plays a big part in that, and how you recover from it and how you sort of frame your frame of reference with it. So, and we'll address some of that. We talked about a lot of those aspects of it in the
previous
gratefulness episode. Yeah. So with gratitude, we'll surely talk about them again, because like you and I were saying before the episode started, although we're going to address some different topics and some different perspectives on it, there are some things that we'll revisit with a new perspective, and with possibly revisiting them to see if the conclusions we came to might be a little bit different.
Yeah.
So, do you think we should redefine gratitude again? Do you think that we've?
I don't. I think just a quick refresher. It used to mean initially in Latin, in Old Latin, it meant thankful or pleasing. By medieval time, it became goodwill. So there's a transformation there, and I'm not sure that we talked about that.
No, I don't think we did.
The last time, that I think is a nuanced but important development, because goodwill is a much broader concept than the more individualized idea of thankfulness, which is more like gratefulness, and gratitude becomes it becomes a thing that I think that Cicero talked about, saying it was the highest virtue, and all of the virtues emerge from it. And so when it becomes goodwill, which is long past when Cicero was writing, but still when that becomes the accrued meaning, then that is the goodwill. Out of goodwill come many other things. Yeah.
No, I think that is important to go over. And we didn't talk about it last time. We did talk about the difference between thankfulness and gratefulness. So if we look at the etymology there, if it started out as thankfulness and then it changed into goodwill, so what is changing there, right? I think in our first episode, we came to the conclusion that thankfulness is sort of it's passive. You can be thankful for something without having to do anything, right? Whereas gratefulness, you have to express gratitude to a benefactor.
There is an activeness in it, yes, and there's also something I didn't dwell on the last time, as to my memory, which is the difference between the propositional and the prepositional. And Stanford talks about that. A number of the encyclopedias and sources talk about that. And that's a larger, more formal kind of issue. I mean, gratitude for X, Y, or Z, or gratitude to. And to is a preposition, to from, and the example, as you know, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is something like, oh, well, I am grateful for, I have gratitude for finding gold in them thar hills, but the hills weren't thinking about me. They weren't giving me a gift. There was no interactivity. Unless you are not only a pantheist, which is fine, but that every single living thing has an intent. And I think that's an interesting view too that we might get into. But from a standard, more Western view, currently probably it's different. Then I am thankful for being well. Okay, fine. Does anybody help me be well? Do I have goodwill toward people who are helping me accomplish that?
Yeah. No, this is, I think that this is really going to be the linchpin of our conversation this time around, that we didn't cover it last time, but I'm going to save some of it for later until we've set the scene a little bit more. So we didn't talk last time about historical thought on gratitude, and there is a lot of philosophy on it. Do you want to kind of give us the cliff notes of the philosophical thought on gratitude?
Yeah, well, as you might expect, this is not necessarily entirely chronological, but there are orientations. So you can have the materialist orientation, grateful for stuff that I have, or a materialist in the sense of the phenomenological encounter with the things that we see with our five senses, that we experience with our five senses. But then there's a gratitude on a theological level, or a spiritual level, which doesn't mean necessarily interacting with a supernatural or omniscient being, but which puts one in the position of thinking beyond the immediacy of life. And so those are two bookmarks, bookends, so to speak. And within that, you have the possibility of levels of gratitude, of goodwill that involve just oneself, and then move up the scale of one's immediates, whoever those are, or one's work, whatever that happens to be, and then upward through to the planetary level. And that, I'm really rushing it, but that's essentially where it moves. When goodwill becomes part of what are your responsibilities to others, what are your responsibilities, as Kant talking about, to the state and the state to you, and these kind of conversations that we've had before. Politics, right? What are our responsibilities to the thing that holds us on, to gravity and the world that holds us onto it? What is our responsibility to this spaceship that we're flying at 60,000 miles an hour on?
Yeah. So again, it's, if you boil that down and put it in a nutshell, it still is prepositional versus propositional gratitude. It seems to be that change happened.
That changed relatively recently. That's fairly modern.
Yeah. And do you think that it relates back to the concept of gratitude, adding on that addition of goodwill, versus thankfulness? Because thankfulness does seem to be propositional, whereas goodwill seems to be prepositional. Wait, did I get that right?
So prepositionalism have gratitude to someone else for
yes. So yeah. So
whatever
goodwill seems
yeah.
goodwill seems prepositional, whereas thankfulness seems propositional, right?
Yeah.
I can be thankful. And again, I think the example they use in Stanford Psychology, I can be thankful it didn't rain on my wedding day, right? I'm going to a wedding later, so I'm sure they're not going to want it to rain.
Right.
But if I have goodwill, it almost seems like you have to have goodwill towards somebody, something.
It is something that is intentional.
Yeah.
It's more of a trained intention. And I think that's what Aristotle was talking about. Is that, we should be grateful not only to those with views we may agree, but also to those who've expressed more superficial views, where they contribute to us by helping us develop our own thought. Now, that's an intention.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's sort of surprising to hear from an ancient philosopher, right? I think we think of them as, especially maybe not so much Aristotle, but Socrates or somebody as the sort of spurning people who haven't thought deeply about something. Here Aristotle saying, no, you know what? If somebody says something just off the cuff or on the surface level, that is still something to be grateful for, because then it spurs your own thinking. And that is definitely true. I think that, it happens all the time with me where somebody will just say something and then it gets the wheels turning, right?
Yes.
I think that my wife, she'll be on the show in a couple weeks to talk about a topic that is close to her, but she doesn't think of herself as being philosophical, right?
But she is.
Yeah. But on a regular basis, she just says something off the cuff. And it's that, I think that there's the psychological element, right? This sort of Jungian or Freudian idea that these things that we just say, not flippantly, but casually, there's a deeper meaning to them, right? There's this idea that, well, you might just be saying something and not thinking anything of it, but that those verbalizations that you make are the result of something working in your subconscious that caused you to say it, right? Indeed. So there is something to it, and Aristotle kind of picks up on that. Well, hey, if somebody's just saying something, even if it's not well thought out or well reasoned or just flat out wrong, it still is something, and that can cause us to think deeply about it and to sort of develop the topic or hone it.
And that goes back to from Aristotle to Plato to Socrates. Yes. And it is kind of surprising in that sense. But once more, a lot of stuff comes out of those 3-4 of the Western view. But then there's the Buddha, who says that gratitude is based on integrity and civility. And it's rather patriarchal, filial piety, the feeling of family, and then thinking of everything as family. Well, that's different than the Western view, but it's still, there's a formality to it because it's based on the idea of integrity. And if we think of integrity, that's consistently, I think I would define it as consistently seeking the truth, even if it takes you places you don't want to go. And civility, which is treating people as you would be treated, right? More or less. That's real, and that is a trained thing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting concept. This extrapolation of thinking of everything as family, because that brings in, if you think of the word relation, right? Well, somebody who's a relation to you is a family member, right? But then if you think about, a relationship, well, we have a relationship with everything on the planet, right? Okay, well, I'm walking on grass. What is grass? Well, grass feeds, a cow that feeds you, or, everything has everything's interconnected in a way that if it's a stretch to sort of diffuse this word of family that way, but it's not it's not technically wrong if you're thinking of it as a relationship. But
No, it's not. And that suffix ship, because I was thinking the same. I was in the same place you were, so I was smiling. So you can have relations, but a relationship is an aware, or becomes, if it's not just static and then sort of the ship doesn't work. It's a process. It's a moving. It's a thinking about the grass you're stepping on or whatever it happens to be. And that thing, that Aristotle, that Aristotelian thought goes all the way through people like one of my oldest friends. She loved Albert Schweitzer, and he talks about that sometimes our spark goes out, and we depend on others, our relationships with others to relight that flame. What he doesn't say in that fairly simple quotation is that often, well, how does flame get lit? Usually with an explosion, a chipping away so that we get a spark, right? There is a grating of something, whether cars, furnaces, or a fire in a camp. And so there is collision. There is not smoothness that is part of relationship, and that is part of what we look toward with gratitude.
Yeah, and this is, I think it's healthy for people to read mainstream philosophers and not agree with them. Mm-hmm. I think because that's like, I think we talked about a couple episodes ago. That's what the history of philosophy is somebody looking at a previous philosopher and saying, well, I don't agree with that. I'm going to try to think of a way of making it better. Right. So in our Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on gratitude, there's a few things where I go, I don't know if I agree with this. And one of them was the context under which gratitude is necessary. And they said with friendship, right? Yeah. Well, with friendship, gratitude isn't always necessary because it's expected, right? If you are a friend, it's the exact same scenario that you just mentioned in that quote. If you have a friend and you end up in a hard place, it's sort of your friend's duty. There's that word again that we talked about a couple weeks ago. It's sort of your friend's duty or responsibility to offer you aid to the best of their ability, and that's just expected. If they don't do that, they're a fair weather friend. And so they're not really a friend to begin with. And language reflects this, right? Because we talked about this a few episodes. The Hidden Brain episode with the Dutch researcher who said, well, no, we don't thank our close friends. That's, it's insulting, right? It's overly formal, right? But I think that your example of lighting the spark, right, is a good example. Your friend in helping you is still giving something of themselves, right? They're doing something that is putting them at the very least inconveniencing them, but in some cases might be giving you a greater part of themselves or their finances or their time or whatever it is in order to help you out. So regardless of the preconceived notions of the responsibilities of friendship, it doesn't negate the fact that they're following through on those obligations, and that sort of help is something that you should be grateful for.
Yes, and whether and to access the Dutch example, or how one is grateful or expresses gratitude, goodwill. Well, you were just, let's go to a really, really goofy, funny example for a moment. We were talking about a cat in a workplace, right? And a person who is not the cat person.
Right.
And the person who the cat chooses to sit on, of course, because that's what cats do, is a person not a cat person. And the person ends up keeping the cat on his lap after the meeting is done. And then does rather stealthy tending of the cat over a break. Okay. But then denies it.
Right.
Now, I'm not suggesting that the cat and the person have an equal balanced relationship. But it's just as a goofy example, and a real example, because many of us have relationships with animals. We perceive a duty. We owe that. Somehow, something is kindled that we then perceive a duty that we didn't even cast a thought to before. A new duty has emerged. How did that emerge? What happened to make that? Is it just because it purred? Is it just because it got up? What kindled in that person's mind? And then you move to the human relationships, and you take things for granted sometimes, but then you slow down and you look at the amazing things that people in one's life do that make one's life richer, and in the not the monetary sense, just in the most important senses. And there are any number of ways to show gratitude. And I don't think and Hallmark cards is one, right? But we don't all have to go out and buy Hallmark cards. Sending notes, choosing to spend time, whatever it is. But those are intentional again.
Yeah.
The guy building a litter box is an intentional thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're really hitting on something here, right? I really like that idea that you brought up. What happened in this guy's mind, right? The cat chose him, and then the cat sort of enforced, sort of imposed its goodwill on this guy, and the guy reciprocated the goodwill. That was the extent of the exchange, right? Was this exchange of affection, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So his affection by itself, right, without any materialistic, monetary, physical, without anything else happening, is just that idea of, hey, you know what? I like you. Is that enough to say, oh, well, I'm grateful for that. I'm going to reciprocate this. I'm going to show that I appreciate that. Yeah,
even if it's just, even if one says, I've known people who constantly sparked every time they encounter one another, and yet I had a situation like that back in my formal teaching days. Someone who was very much people. There were the sciences part of the building, and there was the humanities part of the building, and of course it's bifurcated because that's what our culture does. And you very seldom saw the people unless you were in committee meetings or so on. This person who seemed to have a similar personality for a while as mine, and we were referred to as the opposite number on each side of it, and barely saw each other. But once in a while, would just come and leave a cup of coffee. Of course, stop by the office. How you doing? It's a battle. Yes, it is. Hope you hang in there. And maybe once a year. But there was an exchange with that was human and that was tending. I think the intentionality of goodwill requires attending, even if it's not a daily attending. And that's determined by any number of factors, from proximity to roles to whatever it happens to be. But I think there's the necessity of intentionality and the necessity of tending make goodwill work. Because if you don't have that, and I'm going to, and I told you I was in a mood today. Yesterday I had something else happen that was very much in this vein. Yet another couple of former students. One who had reached out and said, "Happy Thanksgiving." Hadn't heard from him in a while, and lives in Perry and is a masseuse. And I wrote back and said, "Happy Thanksgiving. How would you like a cup of coffee?" And so yesterday, the day after Thanksgiving, and he said, "Sure." So we went to a coffee shop in the town that I live in. But before he got there, one of my other former students showed up that I hadn't seen in a while. And I said, "Hey, got another fellow showing up. You want to sit?" And he said, "Yeah." And when the first came in, they knew each other because they'd gone to school together, but they'd been in different years. And so suddenly we have this conversation. We're laughing and people are looking at us from a different table because we're being jolly. Um, but but the masseuse, who's a writer as well, he talked about, he brought up the topic of gratitude, and we got into this spot where we ended up talking about the idea, and he brought this up, and I've forgotten who the quotation comes from, but it's important. He said, all right, but you tend your own garden, and in tending your own garden, you make the world better. Because I was saying, what am I going to do about Putin? What am I going to do about the Ukraine? But we think about that all the time. But here we were having coffee and spending chosen time, intentional time, out of a day that could have been very busy for them for various ways.
Yeah, and we're seeing intentionality as a big factor in gratitude. And I think that there's multiple dimensions to that. Because, intentionality on the beneficiary's part is one thing. But I think that in some cases, like the example with the gold miner, right? Mm-hmm. He's giving intentionality to a benefactor, even if that intentionality doesn't exist. Because we had a similar thing happen. I won't go through the whole story, but essentially, a guy that we hadn't seen in a long time that was, very close to our family, happened to see my mom returning cans or whatever. And my mom invited him over for a dinner, and when we were at dinner, he said, wow, what are the chances of that? Like, I was there and your mom was there and your mom didn't have a whole lot to return. So she was only going to be there for like maybe 2 minutes. And we happened to be there at the same time. And then there's this other person that we knew that we started talking with. And then she invited me over and now we're here. And now, and so he was sort of going back through the whole chain of events and saying
causal chain.
Yeah. And so just highlighting the fact that, okay, well, it doesn't seem strange. The end result doesn't seem strange, right? Oh, we're having dinner with an old friend. What is there to be grateful for, right? But then you start to look at the chain of events and you say, well, at every single step, there was something that was slightly improbable. And all of those things add up to be something that was highly unlikely, right? And I mean, that's the story of humankind, right? The anthropic principle. Right? You look back and you go, you could easily say, oh, well, why do we exist? Well, because we have to exist to observe the universe. Oh, okay. Well, that's a pretty ungrateful stance to take. But then when you start looking at, okay, well, if the expansion rate wasn't just right, well, if the composition wasn't just right, if gravity wasn't just right, we wouldn't be here. And all of a sudden you go, wow, like, we're extremely lucky. I'm very grateful that I'm here.
Even if it's and there's where it can be the aspect of religiosity and spiritual focus, or it can just be, I'm grateful for chemicals and gravity, and because we wouldn't know if we weren't here.
Yeah, then that's the linchpin is intentionality, right? And I think that's why gratitude is a primary topic in religions, as we've been sort of talking about throughout the episode. Gratitude in any religion is the pinnacle of sort of religious experience, and in most of those cases, that's because there's a God that is giving intentionality to the things that you're experiencing, right? And I think, like we just mentioned, if somebody's atheistic, they can have a place of not seeing an intentionality in the universe, but I don't think it's necessary that they don't see intentionality in some. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that again, for someone who is agnostic and unsure or atheist, I totally respect that, because at best I'm agnostic and probably generally atheist. But the intention comes from acting on a moment that you might not have acted. Now, I can say, well, something else beyond me prompted me to act on that moment. Or for whatever causal reasons, I acted on that moment. The end result is the same, that there was a choice to tend or not to tend, and one tended. And a lot there are many times when we don't tend.
Yeah.
And I don't need to ascribe that to something beyond me in order for it to feel meaningful. But I think there's an extra added layer of interest for people to do that.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about a lot in our first episode was the intentions of a benefactor, right? Do the intentions of a benefactor play into gratefulness, right? If the benefactor has ulterior motives when they're being beneficent, then should we be grateful, or can we even be grateful if there's this notion of reciprocity or of indebtedness? And I think in the episode, we sort of came to the conclusion that you couldn't, right? Like if somebody, I think the example we used was if somebody crashes their car into my house in an attempt to kill me, they don't succeed, and I'm fine, but the insurance company gives me twice as much money to fix my house as what it actually costs. Well, that's a sum net for me. Should I be grateful to this person that had these evil motives for me?
Of course not.
Right. Yeah, we said no. Of course not. We said, and again, sort of mirroring the Stanford Encyclopedia, we said, well, we could be glad that we were given the extra money, that sort of thing, but we can't be grateful to the person.
No.
And I think that this is where propositional and prepositional gratitude come in, right? Because I think that on the one hand, we're right. You can't be grateful to the person who was trying to harm you. But I think you can be grateful that things turned out the way that they did.
Sure, you can be thankful that you didn't die. Of course, and I'm just setting aside the monetary thing. If you can be, well, I survived that. All right. This is and this will probably be controversial and fine. We push back and forth. One of the most to me personally, not speaking for anybody else, one of the most offensive things that I have heard people say to other people, and I've heard it brought up in writing and on radio, with the daily mass shootings. We've had 7 mass shootings in 7 days. And people attempting to offer some balm to say, well, saying to a person who just lost a spouse, God won't give you anything that you can't handle. Now, I do not find that balm-like. And frankly, even though I'm not a religious person, I find that an insult to the idea. If that's what God is about, is making terrible things happen to test you, go away. Then leave. You can have your conversation. I don't think that's what it's about.
Yeah.
And so the intent was perhaps a good intent, but I think it was not thought out as an intentional, attentive to that moment thing to do.
Yeah, and our example of the person crashing the car into the house is basically that same argument behind offering that sort of thing. Because what you're saying is, okay, well, God put this terrible thing in your life, but really it's going to help you become a better person or a better adherent to your religion or whatever it is, right? Is that necessarily false? Well, I guess that would be on an individual basis.
I can't prove. No, of course it'd be on an individual basis, but is it an act of goodwill?
Right. No. And I think that that's where, again, we're getting to the point in the conversation where we're talking about the prepositional and the propositional
Mhm.
gratitude. And that's the other thing that bugged me about the Stanford Encyclopedia articles. They said it's basically accepted by, philosophers that we should just disregard propositional gratitude. Like, it's not really worth talking about. We'll just focus on preposition. No, I think it's very important because I think that this is between the two of them.
Yes.
And especially it sort of highlights a religious mindset in that way, being thankful to something versus being thankful for something, right? I think if you're a religious person and you have a situation like this happen, you can be thankful to God for whatever reason, X, Y, or Z. But if you don't ascribe that intentionality, and I think that intentionality is sort of what divides prepositional from propositional.
It is, because the propositional is, I am grateful that fill in the blank. There's no to or for or.
So in the case of a mass shooting, right? If you say, I'm thankful
that.
Yeah, I'm thankful that I survived. Well, if a loved one of yours didn't survive, what are you going to be thankful that, right? But if you're a religious person, I guess you could say, I'm thankful to God that he's going to make me a stronger person.
And there's that prepositional thing.
Right. Yeah. So as I think that it's very important to look at
your point is well taken. It is.
But I think that but
it's a different orientation.
Yeah. So I think that we're getting into the meat of the discussion now. And I'm really glad because we didn't cover this at all in the first episode. And I think it's very important. So this intentionality or the ascribing of intentionality is the difference between this prepositional and propositional gratitude. And I think that people who don't ascribe an intentionality to a benefactor or don't see a benefactor are unlikely to have prepositional gratitude in a scenario. And I think that the scenario that we were talking about sort of highlights that, right? If you don't believe in God, then if one of your loved ones gets killed in a mass shooting, you don't have anything to be grateful to. Right. But if you conversely, if you do, then you might. And I think that this highlights something, which is to say, is gratitude purely a dispositional state?
Well,
then this is a big question because
that's a great question.
Because philosophical thought, right, has always said that gratitude is based off of two parties, a benefactor and a beneficiary. But if gratitude is purely a dispositional state, right, if I'm ascribing intentionality to the mountain that gave me gold or to God, am I still experiencing real gratitude even if that benefactor may not exist, even if there is no intentionality? Is that still gratitude or is it something different?
Okay. 3 questions there. Dispositional suggests an emotional content, a mental content, an awareness content, a phenomenological experience. But it also suggests a steady state, perhaps, or a chosen state on some of those things. I am disposed to feel good today. Well, is that because I generally do, or is that because I've said I will by thunder?
Did something outside of your control put you in a good mood? There's a number of different things.
Exactly. So the dispositional element of it, I think, can be trained and chosen philosophically, whether religious or not. I'll go back to an example I learned from a friend much younger than I, we are no longer friends. Maybe in some universe sometime that will happen again, but he just disappeared out of life. But he was from Qatar. And he and his then wife, who became a colleague of mine, were they lived with us for 7 weeks while they were. She got a job where I taught, and they didn't have a place to be, and so they lived with us for 7 weeks while they were finding an apartment, getting a car, and so on. And I learned much. We learned much about each other in that intense living state. One day he bumped his head on a mantle. He wasn't tall. He bumped his head on a fireplace mantle in our old home. It's an old house. That's what I mean. And he bumped it and he said, "Thank you." And I said, "Solly, what did you say thank you for?" And he said, "God was reminding me to be attentive." Allah.
Right.
Allah was because he was Muslim. And I could appreciate what he was saying, but he dispositionally was of a mind through his training, social training and so on, that is how one responds. It sounded rather, because it took a moment for him to say thank you. So it sounded like it's not something you would immediately say, but you say it because you're telling yourself that you are being given a lesson.
Right. Yeah, I think you relayed that story in the first episode, and it highlights this idea.
But I have a different thought about it than that.
Right, yeah. Yes. So it highlights this idea, right? So if we look at it, let's look at it empirically, right? So taking out the rational argument of God and just looking at what happened, right?
Bonk.
Somebody received an injury, right? And then decided to be grateful, at least how we've defined gratefulness up to this point. That's what we're trying to get at, is if it actually is gratefulness. Yeah. But expresses gratitude for the injury because it's teaching them to be more aware. So there's an intentionality there.
There's a dispositional element.
So, right. So disposition, that's kind of the big.
But was it goodwill? And was it his goodwill toward the universe, as well as him perceiving the universe giving him an injury as an act of instructive goodwill? I can't. There's both of those things going on there.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up the idea of over gratitude, of being overly grateful. Is this something that actually exists, right? Because this would be the example of that. Would be, well, what do you have to be grateful for here? You received a bump on the head. But he's saying, oh, well, I'm being taught to be more grateful. And what do you have to be grateful for? You had a loved one killed in a mass shooting. Right. Well, God's teaching me to persevere through suffering. So it seems like almost in any case, you could learn a lesson that would cause you to be grateful if you're ascribing intentionality to the benefactor.
Yeah, and that's where I fall off the boat.
I think that's where the majority of philosophers fall off the boat. In a formal sense. I can see where someone would go with it, but it does not gel with my experience of being a human being. So here's where it gets kind of interesting, right? And we talked about this a little bit in the first episode. Positive psychology has a focus on gratitude, and so there's been empirical studies that have been done scientifically that have shown people who feel gratitude in this way, even people who attend religious services, and you account for the fact that they smoke less and drink less and do these other things. When you take everything into account, these people tend to live longer. They tend to be healthier, right? So perhaps, regardless of the reality of the situation, right? Regardless of this fact that maybe a benefactor doesn't exist, maybe an intentionality doesn't exist, perhaps still feeling gratitude in those situations is the right thing to do just for our health, just for health's sake, just to be a healthier human being. And health, the word health in itself is also a very interesting topic.
It is. And there again is lived experience. I will sometimes find myself uttering the word thank you, the words thank you, when something has happened. That comes out of a gladness. And that's the propositional. I'm not, that sometimes it comes out of the prepositional. Thank you for having this podcast. Sometimes it comes out of the, I've had these moments in a day. I've created a piece of art. It felt meaningful. And I was glad to have lived to be able to do it. But I'm not uttering thank you to any benefactor.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what it's just an amorphous thing.
And so, this defining what gratitude is very important because, in the article, right, they say, well, propositional gratitude isn't really gratitude because you could just substitute the word grateful for glad or for appreciative. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's true.
I think that writes it off a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that...
I think it's a different state.
Yeah, the experience, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the experience of my dad dying kind of brought that home to me, right? So, obviously, that's a big thing that people struggle with. And, there's been a lot of members of my family and even people not in my family who knew my dad through other circumstances that are still struggling with it, to this day, a year later. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, when I think, but you can't say the word get over, but no. I think I came to terms with it pretty quickly. And it was sort of stoic in nature in the sense that, I just thought, well, what was I owed at birth from a father, right? Nothing. I was owed nothing, right? My dad could have disappeared from my life. He could have been a terrible, abusive father. He could have been anything. I was not owed anything. Mm-hmm. So I'm grateful that I had a dad. Now and it's different, right? Because am I grateful to my dad? Yes, I'm grateful to my dad for many things, but I'm also grateful that I had my dad.
Yes.
And so can I replace that word in the propositional one? Can I say, well, I'm glad that my dad is who he was, or I'm appreciative that I had the dad that I had? No, I am grateful that I had the dad that I had.
There's grateful weight has more weight.
Right.
Gratitude has more weight.
It's it's expressive. There's an expression to it, and there's an intentionality to it. But I don't know. It's sort of this idea that gratitude doesn't exist if I don't know. It's still a complicated topic.
It is complicated, and it is, and you and I are on the same page with this. I think that for all kinds of intellectually sound reasons, they make that categorization that article does. But it doesn't ring entirely true with our lived experience.
I think the reason for it is this, right? I think the reason for it is because we're all agnostic necessarily, right? Which is to say that there are questions that we can't answer. And so if we can't answer them, if we're in this state of ambiguity, we might come to conclusions about things that may even contradict our beliefs in some.
Oh, of course, because we're contradictory creatures.
Right.
We can't hold the same consistent idea for 10 seconds before another one comes in. That's probably to our benefit. We are not. Yeah. What is it? The consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. We say that to justify our inconsistency. No, I think you've expressed that very well. I don't I think there is an illness in a cultural expectation that somehow we just get on with things after someone has died. And sometimes we code switch for what people may feel or need to hear, because people don't even want to hear died. They want to hear passed. Passed on. Okay, so the traveler stopped at our inn and then passed on. However, whatever euphemistic construct we use to come to terms, which is a capitalistic expression itself, and I have to stop and unpack all of those things, because what we're doing is, so, well, even when we talk about loss, it is a capitalistic object oriented thing. We didn't lose. The person died, but we still have memory, and we, of course, have great sorrow, and we have great joy in the memory, and we have gratefulness for who they were, and we go on. But what is somebody else's expectation of how we move on is irrelevant to what's really going on. Are we at peace with it? And at peace with it does not mean being thankful to the universe that they died. It does not mean the opposite. It just means, yeah, I'm continuing with life because that's what we do. But does that mean I just put them away into a little spot somewhere? No.
Yeah, I think there's like a linguistic there's a linguistic conflict of metaphors around gratitude that is what causes us to have this definitional problem. And I think it might be clear if we try to envision the antithesis of gratitude, right? And I think that you can sort of bring it down to two terms that might help it out. Is the opposite of gratitude entitlement, or is it resentment, right? Because entitlement, I think that that's still operating within this capitalistic, this sort of transactional paradigm, where you're saying, well, for instance, like my dad dies, right? Am I grateful that I had my dad? Or do I feel that I was entitled to my dad, and so now I feel loss due to his absence, right? Or am I grateful for my dad, which the opposite of that would be I resent my dad, right? Well, what do you think? Do you think that sort of trying to figure out what the opposite of gratitude is might help us define it better?
I do, because I think it helps us address some other things. When people who have been, it's overwhelming, the number of the loss just in this week in this country, the loss in the Ukraine, the loss everywhere. But we die. People, we've talked about this. Entropy wins.
Yeah.
Okay. But it is the how, it is the circumstances, it is the, I'm not even suggesting that there's an end date planned. Was it that? But we always used to say, well, it was their time. What? No. But if someone is taken by somebody coming into a room and shooting people when they were in their room having a break, there is nothing to be grateful in that. There is certainly resentfulness that is justifiable. Resentfulness to a culture that worships guns or that is not interested in the least at looking at the problem. There is a resentfulness that person was taken from my life when, other than an extraordinary intrusion that was done with intent, they would still be there. That is fundamentally different than being ill, being well, being ill again, coming to a place where the body can or can't. And I think that's really where the it's helpful to do the thing you just did. Was so let's look at its opposite.
Yeah. So it's it's still a complicated topic, right? We've done 2 full episodes now, and I feel like there's still stuff to talk about. But I am glad that I think that the listeners have heard it. If you go back and you listen to the episode on gratefulness, I think that you will get a complimentary view that sort of continues this discussion, because we did a little bit backwards. This time we covered sort of broad conceptual strokes and we tried to nail down some definitions. In the previous episode, we really look at sort of specific situations and then sort of try to parse apart the relationship of the benefactor to the beneficiary. And I think it all works together really well. So until next time, keep positive.